is not working properly. Give me just a second. There we go. Okay, my name is Philip Labrie. I am a senior BI engineer with Pragmatic Works. I've been developing solutions in the IT realm for over 25 years. Actually, it's more like 30 at this point. I've been a developer, a DBA, consultant, and I've worked in a lot of different sectors over the years. I've moved a great deal of data in the last 30 years. So my big love these days is analysis services, so I want to go ahead and share that with you, and you can follow me on Twitter. I promise I will follow you back if you follow me. So our agenda is we're going to do a quick history of analysis services, kind of explain exactly what analysis services is, go over some of the features, talk about where analysis services would fit into typical architectures that you will find, and then we'll do a demo or two depending on how well we're doing on time, and talk about next steps. So a quick history. All right, I need to move something around on my screen, so there we go. So you can see that Microsoft basically started the ball rolling in the late 90s. It wasn't really used much until 2000. Even then, not many people knew about analysis services. That was when I first started using it with SQL 2000. They added a data mining piece to it, which we won't really go over much at all today, other than to mention it exists in analysis services. It allows you to do things like take the data that you currently have, analyze it, and decide what kind of actions you're going to take. Like in a banking situation, am I going to approve this credit card application based on the data I have before me? So it's a predictive analytics tool. In 2000, they changed the architecture dramatically, gave us a new IDE, and introduced what's called the Unified Dimensional Model, which we still very much use today, except now it's called the Business Intelligence Semantic Model, BISM. So in 2012, we had some great new features. We got the in-memory column store. We got new query language, data analysis expressions, and we ported tabular to Power Pivot. So this tabular mode is the X-Velocity engine, also known as Vertipack. It is exactly the same as the in-memory column store that you see in SQL Server. It is also a tabular mode server level analysis services engine. It uses a query language called DAX, which is very similar to Excel formula language, although it's really a query language and expression language. This is also used as the engine for Power BI. So the tabular mode server is used in a lot of different places, and it's a pretty powerful tool. I'd have to say it's my favorite at this point for a lot of different reasons. So what exactly is analysis services? Analysis services basically gives you the ability to query huge amounts of data, to summarize this data so that you can take action on it. You basically are getting data from a lot of different systems to create this analysis services database. In a typical scenario, you would get data, say, from your ERP system and your CRM and maybe a couple of other systems that are homegrown, and bring that data together for some detailed analysis, because this data happens to cross domains or is joined in domains. So let's talk about our typical data use roles. If you're in an organization, you kind of have workers that are at the operational level. They're your low-level employees, or they're your people who are creating the most data. They're creating the data in their ERPs and their CRMs and all the business critical applications. They're the ones that are filling the database on a day-to-day basis. They're not doing a lot of data reads. They're doing a lot of writes, updates. They may do reads at an individual record level or an individual account level, but they're not really using they're not using a lot of data. They're creating a lot of data incrementally all day long. On the middle tier, we have the tactical management role. These people are consuming more data. They are rolling data up, generally writing reports. You find a lot of these people are creating custom aggregations, usually using Excel. They tend to be pulling data into Excel from a lot of other systems, sometimes a single system. But for the most part, these mid-level people in your organization are using a fair amount of data. Now, at the strategic executive level, you have people who are creating very, very little data. They're not really doing much at all. But the thing of it is that these strategic people, if you flip it around, they're using all the data. If they're doing a good job, they're getting all of it. It's all being aggregated. It's all being summarized so that they can make decisions, strategic decisions, about how to move forward with the company. So at the operational level, we have OLTP databases. The data there has a need to be inserted and updated quickly, individual accounts at a time. But the strategic executive level, you need to summarize a lot. Those are two very different query profiles, and that's where OLAP comes into play. So if you have your OLTP system, your data is generally mission critical. That database has to be up all the time. You have an SLA, you have small windows for service, and generally that's got to be up all the time. So OLAP is generally management critical data. It doesn't necessarily have to be up 24/7, but it has to be available for a reasonable amount of time so that management can use the database to make decisions. And it's more of a big picture database. It's analytical in nature. And again, the query profiles are going to be a lot different. You're going to have huge numbers of records in your queries that are coming in and being summarized. Now, if you are doing a query where you're summarizing all the data for a year in your online transaction processing database, your mission critical database, if any of you guys are DBAs, which I assume a lot of you are, you're going to have some problems with queries like that hitting your live database. So you don't want that. A typical question in an OLTP system is, who has account X? What are the properties of this account? A typical OLAP question would be, how many units were sold in this country? What is my year-to-date expense? Am I hitting my budget year-to-date? How am I compared to last year? So these are the types of questions that an OLAP database answers very well because of the way it's designed. In an OLTP system, while you can do that, it is a lot more cumbersome answering questions like that, especially in a scenario where you want to have a little more self-service BI type situation where people can start answering their own questions. Generally speaking, you're not going to have executives or mid-level people answering their own questions. Sorry, are you getting audio now?
Yes, the audio is fine. I'll let you know if any problems arise.
Okay. I just saw the question.
Yeah,
Somebody wasn't
sometimes a
getting
couple
audio.
people have issues. Don't worry about it.
Okay. All right, so one of the things also about OLAP versus OLTP is the multidimensional model is a lot more simplified compared to the relational model you will generally find in an OLTP system. You're not going to want your users to have to dig through and figure out how to create joins and do queries on your OLTP system. They're going to understand the multidimensional system because the entire design is based around the way the information exists in real life as far as the conceptual outlook of this data. The physical structure matches the conceptual data a lot closer than in an OLTP system. So it's a lot more simplified, and it's easier to use. And we'll go into this a little bit more detail. So let's talk about environments. There are a couple of different types of environments that people end up having. One is you have no data warehouse at all. You only have operational data. Basically, people are just using spreadsheets, and that's about it. A lot of people fall into this category, a lot of small to medium-sized businesses. Another situation is people have a reporting database, and they have a read-only, it's basically a read-only copy of their data. They may change a little bit, they may replicate to another database, and people can hit that. That way those huge queries that we were talking about are not affecting the live database. Now this is a very good strategy and one that I've done before. It's perfectly reasonable, and that's kind of your first step into a full-blown BI scenario, is you want to get those people off the online database. And then eventually you get to a point where you have a data warehouse and you don't have analysis services yet, but you have a full-blown data warehouse, a star schema, and you're putting reporting services reports on top of that, and maybe some third-party tools, and maybe somebody decided to buy some Crystal reports and they're using that too, some Tableau or what have you. This is the point where people, I generally say, if you have a data warehouse and you don't have analysis services, you are creating more work for yourself, a lot more work. One of the great things about analysis services is that it understands the star schema. In fact, with the OLAP server, the multidimensional analysis services, it requires a star schema in order to even begin. So a data warehouse with no analysis services is a great opportunity to begin with analysis services, but quite frankly, all of these scenarios, you'd want to start using analysis services. And we'll talk about when and why in a few minutes. So what you end up having when you have each of these scenarios, ultimately, is you end up having spread marts. I don't know how long this word has been around, but spread marts are basically people pulling data in and creating these gigantic Excel spreadsheets that they then are bound to feed and care for all the time, because this data is constantly being added to and massaged manually in Excel, and they can be quite huge and quite unwieldy. Now, I don't want to disparage anybody who's created spread marts, because they are a clever solution to a problem. However, there are tools to make it a lot easier for people to get the data they need without running into the spread mart slippery slope. So spread marts is one of the things that you want to avoid when you start getting into a more mature BI scenario in your organization. And that's also something that you want to keep an eye out for. You want to go out and look around and see if anybody's creating spread marts. People who are creating spread marts, at first they're very happy about the fact that they've got this spread mart going, but it doesn't take too long before they're weighted down by the responsibility of having to deal with this spread mart on a regular basis. So let's say we have a data warehouse. We've got a nice EDW, and we've got some custom reports, and we build some things out, and people are really happy. This is fantastic. I love this report. This enterprise data warehouse is awesome. You've done a great job, and you have. That's great. So they want more custom reports. And things are going well, and people want more reports. And before you know it, people want more reports, and people want more reports. And you have all these reporting services reports, generally with custom SQL as the data source, and now you've gotten yourself into a support nightmare. It is really difficult to manage a huge number of reporting services reports if they're using SQL all the time. Now, you can have some shared data sets, and that helps alleviate the pain, but you still run into situations where you can't change fast enough because you're using the SQL in the background, and you still run into the same situation that you had before where the queries are not necessarily performing very well. SQL Server T-SQL is not going to perform as well as analysis services when it comes to aggregations. So why shouldn't we report from a transactional system? I kind of talked about that a little bit. And here it is in a nutshell. You've got a data model that looks like this, and you want your end users to report off of that. That's crazy. They're not going to do that. Or they're going to do it and they're going to be so confused. They're going to have joins that are improper. They're going to get bad results. They're going to say something's wrong with this data. Look at all this, and you'll spend a half a day going through their queries only to realize that they didn't really write a good query. Maybe not half a day, maybe an hour. But it adds up, and you get this more and more. And the other downside of this is when they start, let's say this is a shadow database and not the actual transactional database, because we don't want to do that. So let's say they start running these reports and they get bad information because of poorly formed queries. One of two things can happen. They can make bad decisions based on these queries, or they can suddenly not trust the data anymore, which again leads to bad decisions. So these transactional databases, they're designed for these high transaction systems, inserts and updates coming in and out, in and out, in and out all day. If you're aggregating this data, you're locking up this database. You're spilling over into TempDB like crazy. So you don't want to do that. And even in a reporting database, you're going to have slow performance. So that's why you don't want to use a transactional system. So why do you want to use analysis services? Well, the opposite is true for that. You're going to have faster reports because analysis services, in the multidimensional version of it anyway, uses pre-aggregations. That's one of the secrets of its success. It is very, very good at pre-aggregating data and putting that data into discrete tables that you don't know about. So, for example, if you have an analysis services cube and you've got some aggregations that are set up, just some default aggregations, you're going to have things like monthly totals, yearly totals, by category, by, let's say you have products, by product line, by discrete product categories, subcategories, things like that. All those questions that are anticipated to be asked will be pre-aggregated when you load the cube in the morning, or however often you reload your cube. So instead of writing a query that goes out and reads all of those records and sums it all up, what analysis services is going to do is it's going to say, oh, I have the answer to that question. I'm going to go over to this little table, this summary table I already created, and pull that 5 rows for you instead of reading 5 million rows and summarizing. That's how analysis services is so much faster. The other great thing is the metadata. The metadata in analysis services is something that third-party tools rely on heavily. So you are able to easily drag and drop pieces of your database, columns and rows if you will, dimensional attributes and measures, into a report, and an end user can do it pretty easily with a minimal amount of training, oftentimes with no training at all. If they've done any kind of pivot tables, they'll take to it like a fish to water. The main thing here is that the business people generally use Excel a lot, and they're going to be comfortable with any kind of tool that's going to be Excel-like. Then there's the situation, the problem, or the benefit of centralized logic. The problem in the reporting services area is that you may not have centralized logic. So you may have something like a key performance indicator or a calculated measure of a sort, some sort of calculation that's not in your data itself, but is say a margin percent or a gross profit calculation or some kind of business-centric calculation that is not in your system or changes as you look at the data. This type of centralized logic is baked into the database in analysis services. If you're using reporting services and a data warehouse or some of these other scenarios that we were talking about, you might be in a situation where you have to change all your stored procedures or even all of your reporting services reports. So this is also going to help you out a lot in analysis services. Now, let me back up just a second for your faster reports. If you're doing reporting services reports, you can not only summarize with SQL, but you can also do a summarize in your reporting services report. And if you've ever done that against a really large data set, it can take forever, and you can eat up a lot of resources. It's another great thing that those summary tables and analysis services, they help out tremendously. I tried to say tremendously and dramatically at the same time. It's a good mashup. So we have different flavors of analysis services, from Power Pivot to Power Pivot for SharePoint, Analysis Services Tabular, which is the server level analysis services in the tabular mode, and we have Analysis Services Multidimensional. And generally the learning curve is such that as you get to a more scalable system, a more scalable database, it becomes a little bit more difficult to learn and understand. It's not insurmountable, especially if you're already a SQL Server guy. There are a couple of things that will throw you for a loop initially, but the learning curve is pretty steady, and I think that's a pretty good representation of how hard it is to get into analysis services. In Power BI, I think it's somewhere here in the middle between Power Pivot and Power Pivot for SharePoint, and maybe it's growing a little bit further because they're adding new features every week to Power BI. So it's getting to a point where it is both the Cessna and the 747 at the same time. You'll be able to step in with Power BI and not have to know a lot about the tool to get moving, but you can also do some very powerful things like custom visualizations that you write in D3 and put up to the cloud and start using. So that's a pretty important piece to Power BI. And any advance that happens in tabular, that advance is going to happen in Power Pivot for SharePoint, Power Pivot, and Power BI. So as they improve that technology, that tabular technology, it's going to go into all four of those products. So I've thrown about a bunch of terminology so far. Cubes, dimensions, measure groups, attributes, measures, members. These are the words that you will be using pretty much all the time once you're using analysis services. They're analogous to the rows that you're pulling the data from, somewhat. Measures are always numeric. That's what you're measuring. That's the point of analysis services. Analysis services is for measuring and aggregating. If you are looking to write reports that are based on individual accounts, individual records, very small groupings with very discrete detailed information, you do not want to use analysis services. You want to report off of your OLTP reporting system, maybe your data warehouse. Analysis services is for aggregation. So the attributes are columns, members are a distinct value in a row or in an attribute. A dimension is basically the descriptor. So you have facts. I don't have facts on here. I should have added facts. A fact is something that happened. It's the thing that you are measuring. It is what the sale is, or the item I shipped. It is a number that you are summarizing or averaging. In that fact table, you are relating to these other tables in a star schema called a dimension. The dimension describes the fact. So when did it happen? What is it? Who owns it? Anything that describes that fact would be a dimension. So those are our basic terms. Now, when we're talking about any kind of BI tool, any kind of BI database reporting tool, the most commonly asked question is, can you export that to Excel? So I've mentioned a couple of times how easy it is to hook up Excel to analysis services, to report off of analysis services to Excel. This is why billions of people use Excel. Excel runs the business. And I know from experience that a lot of SQL Server DBAs, a lot of programmers in general, don't really like Excel. I was one of those guys too. But the business loves Excel. They understand it. It speaks to them. And whenever you create any kind of reporting services report, they probably ask you, oh, can I export that to Excel? And the reason they ask you that is because a lot of times they're not going to use your report except as a gateway to getting at the data. So why not just give them the data in the first place? Put it in Excel. Just give it to them. Let them have access in a way that's useful to them. So let's say you have an enterprise data warehouse and you've built up your cubes. Your enterprise data warehouse has all the data in your enterprise, all of it, your finance, your sales, HR, your ERP, CRM, all that data. And you've built these discrete cubes off of that using analysis services. That's great. So once you do that, then you open yourself up to these huge number of tools that you can then point at your analysis services database, and people can consume that data in a fun and easy to use way, quite frankly. You use something like Halo BI or Pyramid Analytics or even Excel, and as an end user, they end up becoming delighted. You can also use Tableau. Tableau will consume analysis services. So if you use any of those tools, Crystal Reports as well. Pretty much any reporting tool that's out there now can use analysis services. They were built to use analysis services. So when we talk about cube space, I said cube a little bit, and if you're not familiar with cubes, oh, I see somebody asking about Dundas. Dundas is part of reporting services. So yes, reporting services can hit analysis services. Absolutely. So when we talk about cubes, cube is an abstraction. It's not really a cube. It is a multi-dimensional database. It is a way to think about the data. You can actually have a huge number of dimensions, but our brains can really only comprehend about 3 dimensions. So we use cube. And when you're writing a query against a cube, basically what you're asking for is a region of data. You're asking for an intersection, say between customer and time and product, and you say, I want that region, and then I want you to summarize it by those dimensional attributes that I gave you. That's what's meant by cubes in cube space. So I'm going to take a quick look to see if we have any other questions, and then we're going to go into a demo. So let me just see. Dun, dun. Oh, there's a question about drill downs. So yes, drill downs are absolutely supported. You can define what is going to happen on your drill downs. And there was one other. Okay, So one question that I see on there, and I've seen this before, talking about tabular. If you're familiar with tabular, tabular uses column store indexes. So basically the way it stores its data is radically different than the multidimensional. The multidimensional is using a file storage system. It's putting everything on the file system. Tabular is putting it all in memory in column store indexes. And you could, instead of having a star schema, you could have one gigantic flat table. It's completely flattened out and it has 250 columns coming in, and everything, there's no relationships at all. Everything's all in one giant chunk of data. That will work. It is going to be difficult for the user to use, and depending on how large that data is, it could take a long time to load. And the reason being is, let's take date for example. We know that there are 12 months. There are only 12 months in the year. So if we're going to throw in 12 million records and they each have a month, and let's say it's spread out evenly, we're going to throw in 1,000,000 times. We're going to load in the word December. And as we do that, it's going to take time for the engine to compress that data and throw it into the column store, when really we could have just thrown in an integer that's tied to the fact table. We could have given it a 12. 12 is much smaller. It's going to take a lot less space. Now you multiply that across all the columns that you have coming in, and suddenly you have a performance issue. So that's why you wouldn't want to do that. So I'm going to switch my screen as soon as I can see this. Here we go. All right. Make sure that that is. Yep. Okay. So what I have here is I have a cube that I've already deployed in Analysis Services. And if I'm looking at Management Studio, I have a data warehouse database that's called PW Insurance DW. It's Pragmatic Works Insurance Data Warehouse database. We use this for training a lot. It is a typical star schema where you have a fact table and some dimension tables which relate to each other. The fact table is mainly foreign key columns. There's columns that just have keys to the other tables. And they have the measures. So you have two measures. You have your surrogate key and then the claim number itself. Pretty straightforward, good fact table. Fact tables should basically be narrow and deep. An ideal fact table will have nothing but numbers in it. Your dimensions will have all the information that you need. They should be wide and shallow in general. So I've taken this data warehouse and I brought it into an Analysis Services cube. So I'm going to browse this for a second in Analysis Service or in Management Studio. So this is my browser, and I have a couple of things in here that I can look at. And one of the things that's really nice about this is this great little button here. It's going to allow me to immediately play with my data in Excel. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that, and it's asking me which perspective that I want to view. And a perspective is the same thing as a view. It's very, very similar. It just says, okay, we're going to limit the amount of things that you can look at using this perspective. So if somebody who's dealing with claims only needs to see claims information, that's what they get to see. It is not for security by any means. There is no security on perspectives. So I'm going to fire that off. It's going to create the connection for me. And now I have a pivot table that it automatically created for me to play with my data. You can see on the right here, I've got my measures right at the top, so I can start seeing what I have available to me. So I can throw in my amount claimed and my amount paid. That was a pretty quick query. It did a query. It did it so fast that you couldn't even see it down at the bottom. Now, it's going to be fast anyway because I'm on my laptop and it's got an SSD, but if this was a multi-terabyte database, it still would have been just as fast because it's already got those figures in a small summary table. It's just part of the way it's designed. So I can grab this and I can take a look at my claim statuses. And here are my claim statuses for this data. And if I wanted to, I can go ahead and take my claim date, and I can throw my claim date on here as well. And let's take my description and go over here because I like that better. So already I'm digging into data, and I don't know anything really about computers. I'm not a programmer. I just was given this Excel spreadsheet or a connection to the cube, and suddenly I'm drilling down into data. And I can double click and I can get right into the details. I can see what that cube was made up of for 1,000 rows anyway, for this particular one. So that's pretty powerful. That's nice. And of course, you can also use all of the conditional formatting type tools that people will use to see their data. Now, when you see data like this, you think, wow, claims really jumped dramatically over time. Having looked at a lot of data over time, this immediately jumps out to me as, oh yeah, that's test data. You can see how it has increased over time, but by the same increment, the same amount, same percentage. So that's a great, powerful tool to just jump into Excel that way. So let's take a look at what this thing actually looks like. Okay, so I have my data source. That is the data source that we were looking at, SQL 14. And when I bring this data in to SQL Server Data Tools, it automatically recognizes the relationships that I have between those tables on the foreign key constraints. So I could build these relationships, but the tool is going to figure it out for me, and it's going to build these relationships. Now you can see that this date table has two relationships. And the reason why is because we have two types of dates on the fact. We have a claim date and we have a settlement date. So there are two different ways that this dimension interacts with this fact table. It's called a role-playing dimension, and it enables us to use a single table to come in and be used multiple times. The other great thing about analysis services is it's very data aware. It understands dates. It knows what they're all about. So I can go into my cube when I define it, and I can create a calculation if it pops up. Just thinking about it. I can create a calculation based on date, and it understands things like year to date. So I can build that right into the database, and I can say, this table is a date table. Understand that it's a date table and it's related to my data in that fashion, and give me a year-to-date summary. So if I go back over here and look at this, I'm going to take my claims off. Let me grab my year-to-date claim. And I can see my year-to-date claims. And of course, these match exactly with the yearly, but if I break it out a little bit, we can see that it is doing the actual running total. Now, doing that in SQL Server Management Studio, that would be a trick. Now, you could do the summary. You could go out and hit Analysis Service, or you could hit Management Studio, and I could create a new query. And I'm going to cheat a second because I already wrote this up. And I could write something like this. And this is what I was talking about before. I can do a group by, I can do a summarize, I can do that all on my regular SQL Server database, my OLTP database or my reporting database. That will work. That is perfectly acceptable, generally speaking. But you're going to pay a price. You're going to pay a price later when it comes to maintaining these databases, maintaining these reports, and quite frankly, you may find that people are just trying to get access to the underlying data anyway. So they're going to try and get discrete values and just pull that. So I run that and I get kind of the same thing. I've got my company name, claim status. I can pull all that together in my cube, from my cube just fine. So I could grab my, what do we have, company status, or the company name, right? What did we have? We had company policy type. That's right. And policy type. And that's still, yeah, claim status. Oh, those are the types. Here we go. I'm screwing around here. Here we go. Company name. Oh, it's giving me the hierarchy. That's fine. Here we go. I forgot this is the one I was playing around with hierarchies. That's another nice thing about analysis services, actually. So you can set up these hierarchies that anybody can use. So let's say, for example, oh, I just showed it earlier with the drill down through the dates, but you can do the same thing with a hierarchy that is dealing with, say, geography, drilling down through Alaska, hitting the city, and then hitting the individual company names. So I get that, the amount claimed, and then I can also get my amount paid on there too. So this drill down capability is really handy, and then they can also double click and get the details if they wanted to. Very powerful stuff, pretty much straight out of the box. So that's how that works. Now let's say I'm a smaller company and I don't have analysis services or I don't have a full staff. I can get Excel and I can bring this Excel data in and I bring up a blank workbook and I can go to Power Pivot and get some data. I'm going to fire up the Power Pivot for Excel add-in. Now, the thing about the Power Pivot for Excel add-in is it's available in 2010, 2013, and those are as separate add-ins. It will be shipped as part of 2016. So it's not even a separate add-in at that point. It is part of the product. So if people are saying, well, I don't know if I'm allowed to use it, well, you're going to be allowed to use it as soon as you go to 2016. So I want to take some data from SQL Server, and I'm going to go to my Libri database. I forget, was that my 12 or my 14? SQL 14. And I'm going to check my database out and pick that one. I'm going to select from a list of tables. This is small, but I'm going to hit my fact table first. And then I'm going to select this button that says Select Related Tables. That's nice. It's going to go look at those relationships and add any additional tables that are related. So I don't have to do that. Then I can also clean up my names before I even bring the data in, because this is what the end user is going to see. They're going to see this data, this metadata here. And then I'm just going to call this one, claims. And I finish that up. And it's bringing all that data in, it's compressing it into memory. It's bringing in quite a bit. It's 150,000. It's not too much. Claims, we're going to bring in, I think it's 1 million. I think so. I think it stops at 1 million. Now it's compressing everything, getting the relationships together, and it's done. So I brought in 1 million rows. I can bring in 10 million rows. It really doesn't matter too much. I think you're limited by your resources on your local machine. So I brought this data in, and this designer looks completely different than the multidimensional designer. This looks a lot more like Excel, and this is why Power Pivot generally is in Excel. It's geared towards the business user who's used to using Excel and consumes a lot of data. So down at the bottom, I have these tabs that are my different tables that I just brought in. So I have company, customer, date, policy type, staff, claims, right? So let's say I want to have a sum of amount claimed. I can sum that up and I can get my amount paid. I want to sum that up as well. And then I can hide these two because, again, it's all about summarization, so we don't really need to have these discrete columns. We're going to sum them up all the time. This is called a calculated measure. This is calculated on the fly in tabular. So when I look at the designer here, I can see that these relationships have been created. And you can see that I have a dotted line as well as a regular line. This dotted line means that I have an inactive relationship. One of the downsides of tabular versus OLAP is that it does not support multiple active relationships. So this is a hurdle you'll have to go to work around. The workaround for a situation like this, though, is just bring in this date table twice and have two different relationships to the two different tables. Rename this one claim date and rename the other one paid date, or what was it? Yeah, date of settlement. And that makes it easy enough. So that's it in a nutshell as far as bringing it into Power Pivot. I'm going to accelerate this a little bit. I generally do this talk. I have a couple of different flavors of this talk that I do. I do it on SQL Saturday a lot. I have a tendency to run over, and I also do day-long trainings for these types of things. So I am going to have to accelerate. From this designer, I can go and create a pivot table and hit a new worksheet, and I can immediately go into my claims table, find those calculated measures I created, and I can put my company name on there too. And I can see what the amount paid and what the summary was paid. I can also go back to this, and this is where we have a lot of benefit from analysis services. If I go back to this table and I right-click and select Format, I can format my data as currency, get rid of my decimal places because cents or pennies are stupid when it comes to this type of thing. Nobody wants to see pennies, and oftentimes they'll want to see only in the thousands. So I did that quick change. I go back over, and it changed. It was so quick, I couldn't even see it. It was very fast. So when you make a change to the format, you're making it to the table itself in the metadata, and the rich metadata that's available in analysis services, and then that is available to everyone at once. One other quick thing while I'm in it is, let me go back to this. Oh, I guess I killed that one, didn't I? Go back to this one. We have the concept of key performance indicators, and those are basically just visuals that allow you to quickly tell at a glance, and great for executive reports, what the status of the data happens to be at any given time. So I can take my claim count, for example, and throw that in here, and say, let me see, put some dates on this, my claim dates, and you can see over time my claims have my growth status was green, 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 green until I hit to a questionable area, and then it all went red when my data ran out. So these key performance indicators, once you define them, they're available for all the client tools to use. Anybody can use them, and you have to agree with the business on what they should be. But more importantly, if that key performance indicator changes for any reason, you change it once in your model, and then you're done. So there are a lot of great things that you can do in the model itself. There are a tremendous number of properties that are available in the model. So the thing about the model is you have the ability to add additional data about your model that describes your data. You can describe your dimensional attributes. You can tell the model that this is a date table and use it like a date table and use those additional time intelligence functions. So we have about 10 minutes. Let me jump back to the slide deck real quick. Where am I? Okay, that is not displaying properly. Oh, my monitors just went dead. There we go. Maybe you can see it. Hold on a second. Wow, I only have one screen now. That's weird. Okay. So let me try and get this out of the way and hide. Okay, so yeah, so meta. Pizzas on pizzas. It's so meta. That's because, so we talked about the metadata a bit. We have the business intelligence semantic model metadata. You have the ability to set default field sets for your drill throughs. You can display information for fields and measures. You can even put image URLs in there so that you can have some reports that you know a particular model or a particular object, a particular widget that you're selling has an image. You can tie that in, and your reporting tools can bring those images up and tie data to them. Power BI is really good at consuming that kind of data. You can tag it as geographic data, and you can do some geographic reporting, which is very fun. You can add actions. One of the actions that's great that I've done before is that you can add an action that calls the source system and throws in some parameters like account number. So if you're digging into your data, if you're an information worker and you find an outlier, you can right-click on that cell in the Excel spreadsheet, fire up the application that this data came from, and take a look at those details in the actual system, and then ostensibly fix it. So that's a very powerful piece. And then the formatting. We saw you can easily format your data so that you have a consistent look and feel, and people don't have to go through Excel and say, okay, I got all this data, let me drop the decimals, let me change it to a currency format, let me change it to a percent format. It comes like that straight from the database, and that's because you're building it in your data model. The more you put in your data model, the better off you'll be. The other things that we didn't really go into is you have role-based security. The hierarchies we went through a little bit. The hierarchies are very powerful. I think I had actions on the previous screen, but actions are fantastic. The key performance indicators we went over. Calculated measures, where you can have calculations that are outside of your data, but then are calculated at runtime, at query time. Conditional formatting is available in OLAP, so you can actually change the color and the size of the fonts that are coming out. So let's say, for example, you need to have certain values be bold, or you want certain values to be red. If you're in a negative territory, you want that number to be red and to pop out. You can do that with OLAP. Perspectives are available for both products. Those are just like views. The aggregations are an OLAP feature only. It doesn't really make sense in the tabular world because in tabular it's all in memory. And then the data mining and predictive analytics piece is OLAP only. Again, a very powerful piece of software that I believe is very underutilized. Predictive analytics is very good for the marketing space as well. I forgot to mention that. Sending out mailing lists, things like that. It's easy to take your data as long as you have good enough data that you can make these predictions. The data mining piece can throw very many different algorithms on your data to predict if somebody's going to bite when you send them a marketing email. So you're in a situation where, okay, I know I want analysis services. Which way do I go? You're probably even using it now anyway in the form of Power Pivot or Power BI. These things are similar. They're very similar, but they're very different. Now you can tell pretty quickly in the designer that with the OLAP, it's very much like the big fancy oven that's a traditional oven. With tabular, it's more like a microwave. You can get it in there, get it fast, make it hot. It does a couple of things really well and it does them really fast. But if you want a more comprehensive, more detailed, a more finely tuned product, or something that scales at a very, very large scale, then you're going to want analysis services. So I think of the two as a fancy conventional oven and a microwave. So for security, Power Pivot is just if you have access to the workbook, you have it. It will not penetrate the security of a database somewhere else, but if the data is built into the model, somebody can pass it around, it's already there. You have row level security with tabular and role-based permissions, and multidimensional you have dimension and cell level security using role-based permissions. I would recommend using Active Directory groups when setting up security for tabular and multidimensional. The data sources we didn't really go over very much, but pretty much any data. You can pull any data into Power Pivot or tabular. For the multidimensional, you need to have a star schema data warehouse. It can be Oracle, it can be Teradata, it can be DB2, but you have to have it in a star schema dimensional warehouse or dimensional model. The query languages that are used, multidimensional only supports MDX, the others support DAX and MDX. Here's where the metal meets the road, or where the rubber meets the road. There we go, mixing metaphors again. With tabular, you're going to need massive amounts of fast RAM if you're setting up a tabular server. You need to have fast processors, greater than 3 gigahertz. Slow disk is fine, disk doesn't matter, and you want to avoid virtual machines. With the multidimensional, you want the fastest disks you can get, massive amounts of storage, and you want some fast processors. That's the big difference as far as your hardware requirements are concerned. So, it's all about the model. It is all about the model. You have to build a good model in order for your analysis services to function properly. If you don't, people won't use it. So remember, all that additional metadata, if you're building analysis services, you need to bake that into your model. Okay, so I hit it right at 11 o'clock. How about that? Let me try and straighten out my monitor and see if I can get some questions. Let's see. Questions. I can't. Yeah, I'm having a hard time seeing these questions. Liz, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you ask some of these questions that I can't see? Trying to. Oh, here's how I pop it out. There we go.
Okay, great. I'll let you pick through them.
All right. So Okay. All right. The conditional formatting, that was, somebody's asking how I did the conditional formatting in Excel. It is just off of, it's a standard feature in Excel. There's a button that says conditional formatting. That's Excel 2013. I don't know if it's in 2010 or not. Is it strongly recommended to build an enterprise data warehouse before using analysis services, or is it acceptable to go from OLTP straight to SSAS? Well, it depends. Okay, it depends on how big your OLTP system is, what your SLA is. You probably don't want to go straight against your OLTP all the time, but you can if you're going to refresh your tabular, not multidimensional, your tabular analysis services. You can pull it from your OLTP directly, but you would only want to do that when other users are not on the system so that you don't impact them during their regular workday. How to decide whether to use tabular or multidimensional. I recommend if you're first going into analysis services and you're in a small to medium-sized company, you should only be doing tabular. Multidimensional, if you have an enterprise SQL Server, you should, or if you have a Microsoft Enterprise Agreement, you should use multidimensional if you have a large user base and a large EDW already. Let's see, is OLAP one fact per cube? No, you can have many fact tables in your cube, many fact tables. And in tabular, you don't even have to have your calculated measures in the fact table. You can pull them all out of the fact tables and create a separate table that is not, I forget what it's called, it's a virtual table. And you can throw your calculated measures in there if they're related and if it makes sense to the users. Why avoid virtual machines for tabular? That's a good question. It is my experience that you do not get the higher processor speeds in the virtual machines. They tend to clock those down for everybody. It really depends on your VM environment, but as a general rule, you don't want to mess around with VMs if you can help it. I've had more problems than successes with tabular in VMs. It's not to say that it won't work, it just presents some challenges when it comes to processing the database in heavier loads. Let's see. Would I use reporting services against analysis services cube or just point reporting services directly against the data warehouse? Again, it depends. It depends on what it is you're doing. If you're going after a discrete record, if you're going just for a detail record, go against the data warehouse. That's much better use of reporting services and your data warehouse. Building a data warehouse doesn't mean you're not going to use it, or building analysis services doesn't mean you're not going to use your data warehouse anymore. It's still useful. It's great to use for those drill down details. If there are details that you don't want to persist into your cube, that you don't need to worry about grouping by, that you don't need to aggregate by, keep it in the data warehouse, and as part of your action, you can create a reporting services report. That's another great action you can use, and you can have a reporting services report that brings that detail. And then, is SSAS ideal for detailed reporting, or is it mainly summary aggregated reports? It is mainly for summary and aggregations. Analysis services is all about aggregating. Summary reports should be against a traditional SQL Server database. And I think that is, it's pretty much all the questions here. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions for Philip, you can reply to all your GoToWebinar stuff and it'll come to me, Liz, and I'll be happy to pass those along. Or you can email Philip at plabrie@pragmaticworks.com. As always, this session will be recorded and available on the website, and everyone will receive an email with the link tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.